Well, once again, by God's kind providence, we have the opportunity to be together and with Jesus in our midst, and to worship and to study from His life. And we're certainly happy that in the middle of the week we can do this all the time. The older I get, the more I think sometimes about the fact that I've been able to enjoy, I don't know how many hundreds, thousands perhaps, of worship services similar to what we're engaging in tonight. It might be an interesting thing to go back and just try to calculate how many I've been a part of. But one of these days I won't have opportunity anymore. One of these days, if I live long enough, health or mental problems can occur, and or we'll die. And so it's a nice thought to think that you're with the Lord's people and just singing and reading as Brother Farrah did, and then maybe pillow your head at night and then just, you're through with life. That's a nice thought, but it doesn't usually happen that way to most of us. And but we just want to appreciate every opportunity that we have to be with God's people, whether it be an occasion like midweek or Sunday morning Bible classes or our worship, gospel meetings, whatever occasion it is. We're just thankful to be together. We'll begin in the trials of Jesus in just a moment, but in our reading through the Bible, we're at the end of Jeremiah, and our reading took us through all of Lamentation. If you're with us, Jeremiah, the 49th chapter, 46 through 50 deal with God, or 51 deal with God's judgments against whom? The nations. And keep in mind that God's people in the south, Judah, were thinking that Egypt or Philistia, someone else can be their allies. The very one who could spare them is who, obviously? The Lord. And it's interesting that they went everywhere except the Lord. And so he says these people are going to be judged. In 49, Ammon is mentioned, who in verse 7? Edom. 23, Damascus, representing Syria. 28, Kedar and Hazor toward the north. Way over toward the east in verse 34, Elam. And then in 50 and 51, it's against whom? Babylon. Yeah, your arch enemy, Babylon. It will one day be judged. As reading through these passages, 50 and 51, God's judgment would be on Babylon. Babylon was succeeded by what empire? Who's that, Brother Farrah?
I would say Medo-Persian.
The Medo-Persian, right. I was reminded this afternoon about our study through Daniel. You remember when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the golden image, head of gold and breast and silver, breast and arms of silver, and belly and thighs of brass, and feet mixed with miry clay. And none of his satraps could interpret it. So Daniel was called in, and Daniel not only reminded him what he had dreamed, but also gave the interpretation of it. And he said, "Thou, O king, art the head of gold, and there's going to arise an inferior kingdom to you," and that would be the Medo-Persians. And then there would be one that would go all over the earth. That would be the Alexandrian, the Grecian. And then he says, there's going to be one that would crush those, and yet it would be characterized by feet, legs of clay. What was that? The Romans. And in 44 of chapter 2 of Daniel, that's a passage we all really would do well to commit to memory. In the days of those kings, that would be of the Roman Empire, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And the emphasis is in the next phrase. Nor shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people. The sovereignty of the kingdom God will establish would not be left to another people. The sovereignty means what? Sovereignty of any country, even of the United States, means our self what, Brother Gene?
The power that we possess
On our own.
Over our own.
That's right, our own individual entity, sometimes self-governing, autonomous. We're independent. God is a sovereign God. There's nothing that makes him do one thing or the other. He is autonomous by himself, governs whatever he wants. Anyway, neither shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people. That's exactly what happens here, and it's what we've been studying about in Jeremiah. The Babylonians, who were taking, Daniel and his friends and Judah, their sovereignty would be left to the Medo-Persians, whose sovereignty would be left to the Grecians, whose sovereignty would be left to the Romans, and so on. And yet in the days of those kings, God would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Now, so back in Jeremiah, I just want to make the point that he's saying that even Babylon's sovereignty will be left to another people. God will judge Babylon. And so that's how the book ends. And but it's not all that Jeremiah wrote. He wrote Lamentations. The word means what? To lament means what? To be sad. Sir?
Mourn.
To mourn. To mourn, to be saddened over just a tremendous grief expressed. And he shows that in chapter 1. His lamentation over, the American Standard says, captive Zion, the sorrows of captive Zion. And then chapter 2 points out that all of these sorrows actually come from whom? God. I don't. You can't see my Bible, I'm certain. Well, you can see there's a Bible, but you can't see the markings. I went down and just underscored he. Chapter 2, verse, the middle part, he hath cast down. Chapter 2, verse 2, the Lord hath swallowed. He hath thrown down. He hath brought them down. He hath cut off. Verse 4, he hath been his bow. 5, the Lord is become him. You just go, the Lord is responsible for chastising Judah, but he did it through means. And the means was through what empire? Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, right. In chapter 3, there is hope that is given. The hope is that eventually they would return. It's interesting, we have one of my favorite Psalms. It comes from chapter 3, verse 22, 23. The affliction that they had was there, but the hope of God's loving kindness, or kindnesses, that we're not consumed because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Jehovah is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in him. He's good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. So there was hope, though there would be the captivity that they would experience. In chapter 4, the siege of Jerusalem is described. And looking down in verse 10, the hands of the pitiful women have done what? Yes, they boiled their own children. They were their food in the destruction of the daughter of thy people. And so through all of that, the God's wrath, his justice had been accomplished. And notice in verse 13 of chapter 4, it is because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests that have shed the blood of the just in the midst of her. In other words, can good people sometimes suffer the consequences of evil people? Yes, indeed. That's one thing about the prophets, my friends, that we can appreciate. We get a great perspective of world events, that God can accomplish certain things by using the heinous injustice and terrible powers that be to accomplish other things that he wants. And yet, while evil can be punished, oftentimes good people suffer the consequences of that. Not the guilt, but that's a different thing, but the consequences of the sins of others. And so in chapter 5, there's a prayer for God to remember who they are, their situation, and for them to be restored. He does see down in 5 verse 16, the crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. Verse 21, turn thou us unto thee, O Jehovah, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. At the present time, that described the situation with them because of their own sins. Comment or question? Anyone? David, you look like you're in thought there. You wanted to share with us? All right. We'll begin in Ezekiel, then our readings, and continue on. All right, let's go into the life of Jesus. And we have come, of course, down to late Thursday night, the wee hours of Friday morning. And I want us to come back to our charts. Remember where we are. Years of preparation, beginning ministry, 2 years in Galilee, about 6 months of retirement from the crowd, about 6 months in the closing ministry, and now the last week, 10 days, are where we are here. And the Thursday, we had the preparations for the Passover. Strife develops. Then they eat the Passover. Jesus washes their feet. He says, one of you is going to betray me. And then he leaves. And then a new commandment give I thee. I saw in John 13. Then one of you will deny me. And then we have the lengthy, the Lord's Supper is instituted. And we have the lengthy speech in 14, 15, and 16. And where are we here? Yes, and then in 17 is prayer. And then they leave the upper room, go to the Kidron, between the Kidron and the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus prays, and then he 3 times. And then he's betrayed, arrested, forsaken by the apostles. And we talked about these applications on Sunday morning, so we'll not go back to that. All right, now we've been over here. Here's the wall surrounding Jerusalem and the Temple Mount itself. Well, again, remember that's about 35 to 40 acres. And the Garden of Gethsemane is somewhere in here. We have the Mount of, you see it there, Mount of Olives, Kidron Valley, and the Eastern Wall. Now we're moving over to this section, which is where the apartments, the house, it says the house of the high priest, likely in this area, more of the southwestern side. And what we have is the first stage, only the first stage of the trial of Jesus. If you'll look at, let me just do it this way. This is from your chart on 102. We want to keep in mind the 2 major divisions of the trial of Jesus. First was the Jewish phase or phases. Jesus is taken, which was illegal. All of it was illegal, the way they did it. But there was a private examination before Annas, who was the high priest by law. A high priest, when a person was appointed, how long was his service? All life. But the Romans understood that with the priesthood, the people also who were in leadership, enjoyed a type of a political, maybe a viewpoint that they were political leaders as well. So the Romans, thinking that there might be too much authority vested in one person, began to appoint others. And it was so that Annas was able to appoint about 5 of his sons-in-law as high priest. So Caiaphas was one of them. So he's examined first before Annas, only recorded in John. And then he's taken by these men, these leaders, to Caiaphas before maybe we would say a caucus, or not the full Sanhedrin, but enough where they could arraign him. And he's condemned by Caiaphas, mistreated by the Sanhedrin, until likely around daylight, where the Sanhedrin, and when we say the Sanhedrin, the word Sanhedrin is not actually in the Bible. What word is it described? The council, that's right, the council. And the Sanhedrin was the high court of the Jews. Usually it was presided over by the high priest. There were about 70 of them. Brother Gene mentioned that. Sometimes considered 71 if the high priest needed to cast a deciding vote. And it was to meet only during daylight hours. And so to give it some some semblance of legality, they waited till probably around daylight and brought him before the Sanhedrin, where they charged him of being really a blasphemer. You're the Son of God. But that wouldn't do. That they could not. They would know if they brought that charge to Pilate against Jesus, that wouldn't stand. That means we would say an ecclesiastical matter in a Roman court. And so they had to change the charge. And they changed it from being a blasphemer to the point that he says he is a what? A king. And so then that got their attention. And so he's brought before Pilate. Pilate could find no fault in him. Since Herod was Herod's jurisdiction was over that. He was residing there in Jerusalem at that time, usually at Caesarea, but he was there at that time. Pilate brought Jesus before Herod. Herod wanted to see some miracle performed, and Jesus would not accommodate him, but found no fault, so he sent him back to Pilate for the second time. And Pilate said, well, even his wife said, I've suffered many things in a dream because of it. Had nothing to do with this just man. And so Pilate was going to let him go. And the crowd responded, anyone who makes himself a king is not Caesar's friend. And so finally, I'm leaving part of this out in the overview. He even wanted to release somebody, Barabbas. And we'll give somebody else. No, crucify Jesus. And so finally, Pilate washes his hands ceremonially, trying to show that he's not having anything to do with it, but he really couldn't rid himself of that. And so he sentences Jesus to die. And so that's where we are in our study. And so we come, let's see, I had one other thing I wanted to do. Yeah, this is one thing I wanted to mention. Keep in mind that while the main storyline follows Jesus through the various stages of his trials, there are two subplots going on at the same time. And we'll see the first with Peter very quickly. First, Peter denies Christ on 3 occasions. And likely that was happening during the Jewish stages of his trials. It's mentioned at least during that time. A second subplot involves Judas. Though Matthew records this at a time that must have occurred between the Jewish and the Roman stages of his trials, if you look at Matthew 27, it's likely that Matthew places Judas' remorse there between them for topical reasons. Matthew's account indicates Judas returned the money to the priest in the temple, and yet the chief priest remained with Pilate until he sentenced Jesus. This likely then puts Judas' return of the money after Pilate sentenced Jesus. Regardless of when it was, it's another event or plot in the story concerning Jesus' trial. Just keep that in mind. You've got those two subplots going on during the trial. Both Judas and Peter were similar in being unnamed objects of Jesus' predictions during the Passover, that one would betray him, another deny him, but the subsequent narrative will show how differently each handled his own sin. Peter becomes a wonderful example for everyone. He went out and wept bitterly. And then he came back, and even Jesus gave him, it's almost like in John 21 when Jesus appears to the disciples there at the Sea of Galilee, and he has a little charcoal fire going, and they have breakfast together. They've been out on the sea. And Peter is there. And he says, Peter, or Simon, lovest thou me more than these? Tend my lambs, feed my sheep. He does it 3 times. And Peter's, evidently there was the tie to the denials versus now I'm going to receive you back. And Peter, of course, becomes a spokesman in those early chapters of Acts. Judas, though, sees that Jesus is handed over to them. He goes out and does what? That's right. Actually, he first brings the money back and said, I have sinned in that I betrayed innocent blood. And he wants to give them the money, and they say what? We don't want it. It was okay for them to use money from the treasury to pay Judas to have the whereabouts of Jesus. But when when they get what they want and Judas brings it back, they don't want it. What kind of thinking is that? And so then he went out and hanged himself. So Judas' name goes down. That should just be in infamy, not for, but in infamy. All right. So here we are back in the first part. Let's look at page 102 of our notes. And then let's read. Let's just read these passages. We've talked about it. The chart at the top of 102. Now let's move. And I wanted to call attention just to one thing before we do read. In John 18, in 2 through 11, we've had Jesus in the garden, his self-identification, whom seek ye. And then in 12, 13, and 14 is where he takes, where they take Jesus to Annas. And then 15 down through 18, what's going on? Peter's denial. Yes. And so that's evidently during the early part of the Jewish trial. And then you pick back up in 19, the high priest therefore asked Jesus, it's like 12 through 14 gets Jesus into Annas' house. And then 19 through 24 is where we have a private examination before Annas. And then you'll notice in 24, Annas therefore sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. And then 25 through 27, what do we have? Peter's denial again. Then picking up in verse 28, they led Jesus therefore from Caiaphas into the praetorium. It was early. Now, they led Jesus from Caiaphas. Did John include what happened with Caiaphas? They took him to Caiaphas and then they led him from Caiaphas. So actually we don't learn from John's account what happened during the second stage of the trial, and that was when he was before Caiaphas and was formally indicted, we might say, during that time. But then it just picks up, they led him from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and that's what it's going to get before, he'll go before Pilate. All right, let's read, just to kind of get you the flavor of the fact that not all of the accounts mention everything, that there are specifics that are emphasized, and we have to put it all together for that. Luke is the only one that mentions about being before Herod, but we'll get to that later. All right, let's read 12 through 14, Patty, if you would.
Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people.
Yes, he'd done that earlier. Let's get him out of the way, that there are all kinds of people believing on him. There's going to be a division. The Romans may come in. Let's just get rid of him. All right, now let's drop down to 19 through 24. David, if you would.
The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in the secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said those things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. Well, why do you strike me?
Okay, thank you. There are, Brother Gene mentioned this Sunday morning, and I have some of these mentioned down on number 2, the illegalities that were involved in the trial of Jesus. I'm hoping that by Sunday I'll have just a listing for you that will state in a brief what they did that violated their own law. It was just from the arrest in the garden to the private examination. They were to do that, especially on a capital offense, and then taking him and the smiting him. The fact that there were not even 2 witnesses that could agree, that would have thrown the case out. In fact, we got this in one of the questions, when a witness lied about something on the capital ground, the very death penalty would be turned around on the one who brought the false charges against him. None of that was exercised during the course of the conduct of this trial. Let's answer some of our questions now. Number one, under the first stage, to whom did the band, chief captain, officers of the Jews lead Jesus first? Annas. What was his relation to Caiaphas, who was the acting high priest? Father-in-law. Yeah, there were some put it like this, that you had the rightful high priest, and then you had the one who was actually recognized by the Romans. One by law, de jure, one by practice, de facto. And so they carried him to Annas first, really out of appreciation for him and respect for him, and who should have been the acting high priest. But Caiaphas was. I mentioned in the note, this man is mentioned a few times in the New Testament, Luke 3, here in John 18, and also in Acts 4, verses 5 and 6. He had been appointed in 6 AD, was deposed by Valerius Gratus about 15 AD. While he had been deposed, he remained a ruling spirit of the Sanhedrin. The law stated the high priesthood was for life. However, believing there was too much power given one man, Romans deposed the lawful high priest and set others in his place, usually with consent. As high priest, therefore, and as head of the Sadducean party, the people looked to Annas before Caiaphas, taking Jesus to him first. The influence of Annas is shown by the fact that he made 5 of his sons and sons-in-law high priests. He's said to have been about 60 years old at the time. He questioned Jesus for the purpose of obtaining, if possible, some material out of which to frame an accusation. Do you think that was lawful? Not at all. Based on, or our court system, based on really Romans, based on Jewish, that a person did not have to testify against himself. That was all waived in this. Did this man Annas ask Jesus any questions? Yes, a number of them. Did he desire that Jesus testify against himself? Yes. Jesus responded by saying that he taught how? Openly. And the high priest would do better if what? He would ask those who heard. Yeah. Why don't you find those witnesses who heard me say all these things that you allege I've said? All right, let's move on now to the second stage of the trial. Jesus will be condemned, and this is really where some of the torture begins. Let's keep ourselves in John and just read verse 24. Kirsten, if you would, just verse 24. All right, now let's turn backwards all the way to Matthew 26 and just read Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's account of the same. Matthew 26, verse 57. Kirsten, go ahead and read that. 26:57 in Matthew.
Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered.
Okay, so they're all together, and at least the leadership is. Now go down to 59. It's interesting, 57 through in 58. Peter, it deals with Peter. Verse 58. Peter followed him afar off. And then 59 through 68. First, read that, please.
Now the chief priest and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at least 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent.
All right, let's turn over and read the rest of the passages, and then we'll come back and put it all together. Mark 14, 53, and then 55 through 65. Paula, if you would. Mark 14, and first verse 53, which is just really this is kind of in anticipation of his being with Caiaphas, showing they led him away from Annas. 53, Paula.
And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes.
It's interesting that all the accounts mention all these leaders are present for all the proceedings. And then drop down to 55 through 65, please.
And the chief priest and all the council sought for witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witnesses agree together. And the high priest stood in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee?
Let me pause. Let you pause for just a second. What is Caiaphas trying to do? Make what? Make Jesus do what?
Confess to blasphemy.
Yeah, make him a blasphemer and solicit from him information that more of a charge could be made against him. All of that is just so illegal, as well as hatred. He's just, trying to find something, that reminds me, the antidote of all this is love. Love believeth what? All things, yeah. Unless proved otherwise. All right, Paula, keep going. Where are we? 61? Yeah.
But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou not the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands.
Yeah, they are. When Jesus gives himself up, they become fairly bold, don't they? He could have just spoken, and they could have been wiped off the face of the earth. But all right, let's go on, Brother Farron, if you would. Luke's account, Luke 22:54, and then 63 through 65. Luke 22, verse 54, and then 63, 4 and 5. Luke 22:54.
Breaking in your Bible and it's pages stick.
Okay, it's a good time for you to be turning. I want to call attention for everybody. We find what's going on. They seized him and led him away. And what's the next event recorded? In Luke's account, he doesn't go to Caiaphas, but to
Annas first.
yeah, well, yes, and to Peter, to what's happening with Peter and his denials. But okay, 54 and then 63 through 65.
Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance.
All right, and 63.
And having now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him.
All right, and of course this was all illegal to treat a prisoner that, had not formally, yes, he had confessed he's the Son of God, and then be brought before the Sanhedrin, but still that was an illegal thing for them to do. Let's answer our questions down at the bottom of page 102. In this second stage of the Jewish trial, he's led into the house, into whose house at this time? Caiaphas, right. And I mentioned in the note, it's very likely Annas had apartments in the same palace with Caiaphas, and that from these apartments, Jesus was led into some hall large enough to hold the Sanhedrin, which had now convened. When we were in Israel, I remember our guide and some others thought, because I was very fascinated by it, I was wondering, is there any kind of finding that would show where the Sanhedrin actually convened? And they don't have anything that is really definite. But there are some traditions that suggest that it was actually, they went down steps from the Temple Mount and then had kind of an apartment or compartment underneath the mount itself that would hold, at least 70, 75 people. But that's kind of interesting there. They led him there, and then from Annas to Caiaphas. I mentioned in the note there, this was not its formal session as a court. It was more in the nature of a caucus or committee of the whole. The whole proceeding must have ended around 3, somewhere around there, early in the morning. And then they spend time doing what to Jesus?
Scourging him.
Well, not yet.
Scourging him.
Not yet. They hadn't got to...
They planted a crown on him.
spit on him, hit him with the palms of their hands and their fists, and what was that? Mocked him. All of that stuff was done even in the second phase of the Jewish trial. We haven't even gotten him to Rome yet, to Pilate and Herod. This is going on during the Jewish trial. And then the soldiers themselves, a little bit later, will carry it on. I mentioned in number 2 at the bottom, the trial of Jesus was illegal from every point of view. Before it actually began, the arrest of Jesus was illegal because it was effected as a result of a bribe, the blood money Judas received. Then it was illegal because of a private examination by Annas. No capital offense was to be tried in any form privately. Additionally, rather than already having evidence sufficient to condemn, Annas sought to gather evidence from the accused in an illegal fashion. Next is number 4. No form of the Sanhedrin was to meet during the night to try a case, even a small caucus of them. At the same time that this illegality occurred, the junior Sanhedrin violated their own law by refusing to give Jesus opportunity to make a defense. They wanted to hear him make confession, but no defense. Of course, asking Jesus to testify against himself was illegal, as it is now in our country. Receiving contradictory testimony in a capital offense case would dismiss the proceedings. Not even 2 could do what? Could agree together. And the closest they could come to was, he said that he could destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And one account says that the temple made by hands and build one that made without hands. Actually, that's just a corruption of what he said in John 2, when he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And John said he spake of the temple of his body. His resurrection is what he was talking about. So they twisted that. It's interesting, though. Do you think they actually understood he was talking about his body after they crucified him and when he was put in the tomb? You think they were thinking, yeah, because they said this deceiver said he would rise again after the 3rd day. So what did they do?
They asked Ron
They-
himself.
Exactly. They put guards around the tomb itself. So I believe they knew that, but they were twisting things he had said. Nobody in this room's ever had anything they've said twisted. Oh, that happens. Especially when somebody wants to hurt. Somebody said something. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say this probably was about 3 o'clock in the
Possibly.
morning, around that time?
Yeah, and that would give a little time that they're, because he said the mistreatment before they would actually
Right.
have the Sanhedrin convening possibly right around
The
daylight?
reason that my mind was thinking of time, and 3 in the morning till the time he was on the cross, which was 9 in the morning.
About
was
6
about
hours.
6 hours, that's how long he was on the cross.
Yeah.
So all this that he went through
Yeah.
is equal to
Was
that time.
about the time that he actually was alive on the cross. That's right. Good point. Real good point. All right. And then keeping on, receiving contradictory testimony, we read that. This was overlooked as their witnesses denied. In a capital punishment, the 8th thing here, Jewish law did not permit the sentence to be pronounced until the day after the accused had been convicted. How then would you describe this gathering, and what feeling toward Jesus must they have had to prompt such activity? Okay, first, you would just describe the whole proceeding as what?
Illegal.
Illegal, yeah. And what prompted all this? Their what? Their hatred. Pure, unadulterated hatred. How should witnesses and their testimony be taken when described as it is in Mark 14:55 and 6? Read also Deuteronomy 19:15 through 21 for their law on the matter. There had to be in a capital offense, there had to be how many that it would agree? That 2 or more had to agree. And if a witness lied, then what?
He got the sentence.
He got the sentence. Yeah, exactly. What testimony did the false witnesses give that he would do what? Destroy the temple of God made with hands and build another without hands. Let's do one more and stop. How was this a perversion of John 2? Well, we've already answered that. He spoke of his body and his resurrection from the dead. And I mentioned what we did orally just a second ago in the note. From their diligence in guarding Jesus' tomb the next day, that is the day after his crucifixion, it would seem they actually understood the significance of his words. If that were true, then this shows the Sanhedrin's willingness to receive testimony that was immaterial to the case. They were willing to just forego all semblance of justice.
Wasn't he allowed to have somebody stand with him as well by their law?
Yes,
Like we have a lawyer?
yes, and no, some defense, and didn't allow it in Jesus' case. All right, we'll have to stop there, and Lord willing, pick up with the next part, finish up Jesus before Caiaphas, and then his formal sentencing by the Sanhedrin will be the 3rd phase, and then it will be taken to Pilate. Any comment or question? Any last thing? David, you look like you're